then once it's through the room, I'll just wait for Oliver to give me the thumbs up. All right, so we are in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 38. And we have been looking for a couple weeks now at this story about the Pharisee, Simon, who has Jesus over for dinner, and for the sinful woman who comes and anoints him with oil. And so last week we looked at verses 36 through 38, and I'll go ahead and just read that. I think that's what's up on the wall. Good. Then one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and sat down to eat. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil and stood at his feet behind him weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. And she kissed his feet and anointed them with the fragrant oil. Last week we looked at the difference between the approach of the Pharisee and the approach of the sinner. One came skeptically, unsure, and ready to reject if he saw anything that didn't look right. The other came repentant and thankful and really filled with love for the Lord Jesus Christ, and in many ways kind of audacious in her approach to showing that to Jesus, even in the house of a Pharisee. And so we looked at those two approaches to Jesus, kind of the hold Jesus at arm's length and the grab a hold of him for all you're worth, two approaches to Jesus. And so, for those of you who are joining us this evening on our YouTube channel, or often it's after this evening, so whenever that is, you all join in. I'm glad to have you with us. We missed last week because our microphone wouldn't connect, so sorry about that. But if you were here last week, yay, that's the good thing about being here, is you get it, whether the microphone cooperates or not. So this week, we are going to be looking at various times in Jesus' ministry where he shared table time with people. So I called tonight's lesson Eating with Jesus. And if you remember, I don't know, several months ago, I don't think quite a year, but a long time ago, we looked at all the different instances where Jesus was in a boat, which is kind of an interesting deal. How seems like a lot of times Jesus is in the boat and different things happen while he's in the boat or outside of the boat, and the disciples are in the boat, and it's somewhat similar to that with eating. With table fellowship, you get this view of kind of a different band of Jesus's ministry. Often in the boat, they're going from place to place. Often in the boat, they were, the fishermen were doing their job. That was a big part of those stories. At the table, you get an interesting view because the table was a very important place in the first century. It actually, and we'll get this more towards the end, but it actually is a very important place in the 21st century. We've just forgotten about it. In an era where many people don't actually eat at a real table with other people that they want to be eating with, we've kind of lost some of that culture. We tend to think in terms of perhaps like we just had recently, the rehearsal dinner, where people are all coming from all over the place and you're sitting and conversing. Churches have the occasional potluck. The family meal table, a lot of times it's Thanksgiving is what people think of with that real table fellowship. There are cultures still around today where an hour and a half, 2 hours is not uncommon every evening for the family to sit around the table and just slowly saturate in the food, the fellowship, and I think that it's probably a part of what's wrong with our country, that for the most part, most people like pull something out of the freezer or refrigerator, throw it in the microwave, find a comfortable chair in the living room and watch the news or sports or a sitcom or whatever. And that's mealtime for them. And so that's not how it was. Obviously, you probably knew this. They didn't have microwaves in the first century, so that would have been much more difficult. Also, refrigerators did not exist. And so you see Jesus going to people's houses for meals, and I wanted to look at that. And this is one illustration. This Pharisee has Jesus, and it's a way of kind of saying, I'm going to extend kind of some welcome, some hospitality for you to come in. And while he's there eating with the Pharisee, this woman comes in, and for the first century kind of what's going on in the story, it would have been highly inappropriate for her to come uninvited into the Pharisee's house during a mealtime. And so she was breaking all sorts of unwritten rules. But actually, as we'll see later in this story, the Pharisee is also breaking some unwritten rules in his kind of aloof, inviting Jesus to eat, but not really inviting him like he's belongs at the table. So that's this story. That's a part of what's going on in the cultural background of this Pharisee and this sinful woman. We see from the Gospel of Luke that this isn't the only Pharisee that invites Jesus to his house. In fact, it's interesting. A lot of times we think about how Jesus is always eating with sinners, but there's more stories about him eating with good people than with bad people, though it is fairly evenly mixed. In Luke 11, 37 through 40, as Jesus is speaking to the people, a certain Pharisee asks him to dine with him. So he goes in and sits down to eat. And when the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he had not first washed before dinner. So here's an opportunity for the Pharisee to bring Jesus in. And again, here's a fellow who's got the same approach to Jesus as the last Pharisee did. Invite him in, but hold him at arm's length. I mean, you got to check the right boxes before we will totally embrace you, and perhaps with a little bit of a lean by this time in Jesus' ministry away from accepting Jesus. Certainly later in the story progression of the gospel, the Pharisees are all out like laying traps for him and trying to get him in trouble. This is perhaps a midway point. So the Pharisee asks Jesus to dine with him. He goes in and sits down to eat. Pharisee sees it, marvels he hadn't washed. And by the way, we tend to think of washing like to wash to get germs off of us. They had a different process for this. This was because you needed to have kind of keep yourself holy, and ceremonial washing was part of doing that. I think I said this last week, but one of the reasons for the ceremonial washing was as if you didn't pollute yourself, you were able to take sacrifices, go to the temple to pray, go to synagogue to pray. There were a lot of different things that you couldn't do if you were ceremonially unclean. And one of the ways you could become ceremonially unclean was touching something that was unclean. And there were other things that if you touched them and then you ate afterwards, that would make you unclean. And they had at this time, so I say at this time, we know they had all sorts of goofy stuff at this time because Jesus mentioned some of them. The real document that lists all of the goofy things they're arguing about at this is like 200 years afterwards, where they're talking about this is what makes you unclean, or this rabbi said that's what made you unclean, and that rabbi says this other thing is what makes you unclean. and they had all sorts of different ideas about what would make you unclean or wouldn't make you unclean. If you passed downwind from a Gentile, if you covered your nose and mouth with a cloth, that kept you from becoming unclean. If you didn't, you would become unclean. If you drank out of a pitcher that had a Gentile drink out of it, that would make you unclean. If you poured from a pitcher, this was my favorite kind of debate. There was actually two theories. If you had a cup and there was a pitcher and a Gentile needed a drink, like out of the local well, if they broke the water falling from the pitcher into their cup, the Gentile germs, uncleanness, didn't go up into the pitcher and the pitcher was fine. If it ever had a direct line of the, so like electricity almost. If there was ever a direct line of water from the cup to the pitcher, if the pitcher was ceramic, it had to be broken. It just couldn't be cleaned. If it was stone or it was made out of metal, it could be ceremonially cleansed before it was used again. And so they had all sorts of crazy things that were part of this. And just the best way to be safe was just to make sure that you were washing yourself regularly. Jesus says to this Pharisee, "Now you Pharisees make the outside of the cup and dish clean, but your inward part is full of greed and wickedness. Foolish ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also?" And Jesus uses this opportunity to say the internals are more important than the externals. And you will actually see this is a strong theme within Jesus eating with people. The internals are more important than the externals. And I think it's one of the reasons why is because there are always so many externals that are involved in eating. And even in our culture, we have this. Besides weddings, the table is the most etiquette-driven moment of our lives. There's a side that the fork should go on. There's a place where the coffee cup versus the water cup. If you've ever gone to a fancy restaurant, you get like 4 different forks. There's a deal on how those forks are supposed to work. There's a direction that you're supposed to pass the potatoes when you're passing them. Now, if you just warm up a Hungry Man deal out of your freezer and sit down to watch the evening news, not so much. And I think that's partially why Americans have enjoyed kind of going that direction. There's a certain way to take food out of your mouth if you don't want it in your mouth. There's rules. Like, it's rude. If it goes in with a fork, it comes out with a fork. But you didn't know that. If it goes in with your fingers, and some foods you can eat with your fingers, and some you can't eat with your fingers. By the way, you probably knew that, right? Kentucky Fried Chicken, fingers. Chicken cordon bleu, fork, right? Right? Chicken enchilada, fork. Taco, fingers, right? So we, that's, but, and if you do the wrong, every now and then, you kind of do the wrong thing. One of the stories that at least makes it through my growing up years was when my parents had some people from India over to their house and fed them spaghetti because they knew they couldn't eat meat. What they didn't know was they couldn't use silverware. And how do you eat spaghetti? Obviously with the garlic bread, right? Well, that doesn't work so slick. But that's kind of an interesting, that can happen where it's like that there's a cultural difference between things. There's lots of cultures where you can eat all day with your fingers, any food with your right hand, but don't ever touch anything that goes in your mouth with your left hand. That's fairly common in different societies. But what is more important proper table etiquette or enjoying the fellowship of the people who are sitting at the table. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where like maybe when you were younger and someone's like, okay, we're going to go see this very important person and you are going to be on your best behavior and I don't want to hear you slurping out of that spoon and, oh, please don't see me, you tip that bowl up to drink the last little bit. It's, if you can't get it with a spoon, you can't get it. And so, and wipe your mouth before the cup, and this poor kid in the back of the car is like all of this information, and then you sit down, and they're like, okay, wait, which one's the salad fork, which one's the dinner fork, and it's like it totally ruins the entire meal. That can happen. Jesus is like, if you got to get something right, get the inward part right. Get what is important right. And by the way, etiquette, the purpose of etiquette is supposed to help make people feel comfortable around each other. And so the Pharisees were great with rules. They were great with rules. And let me just say, sometimes we as Christians are really great with rules too. That's something I think as believers we need to be careful of. Don't ignore the outside of the cup. It's nice to have the outside clean, but make sure the inside is clean. That's the most important part. All right. The third, I'll just give you the three that we have of the Pharisees in Luke chapter 14. And I'm guessing that they were somewhat close in time period during Jesus' ministry. And we see it moving a little bit more standoffish here. It says in 14:1-6, it happened as Jesus went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. Now, I don't know about you, but this to me sounds like a setup. Like they're like, why don't you come over to dinner with us? This is a leading Pharisee. And we'll also happen to have a guy there who's got a disease. And we've heard tales about you healing people on the Sabbath, but surely this disease you will not heal on the Sabbath. Not in the ruler of the Pharisees' house on the Sabbath. And it doesn't say this, but one assumes, how did Jesus get to this ruler of the Pharisees' house after Sabbath? I'm guessing he was in the synagogue. They're like, oh, Jesus is here. Let's invite him over for a Sabbath day meal. Jesus, answering, spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees. So here we see some of the rest of the people that got invited over for Sabbath dinner. Let's get the man with dropsy. Let's get more Pharisees, and let's get some lawyers involved. Now, lawyers aren't what you're thinking about. People that are, small crimes court, divorce lawyers. This wasn't this kind of lawyer. These were people who were experts in the law, meaning Moses said such and such. What does that mean today? And these were kind of the arbiters often of what did it mean? Thou shalt not work on the Sabbath. And so they'd set out all the rules, and so they were the ones to have there to make sure if Jesus did anything unlawful, that the word would get out quickly. So Jesus sees this, and I think it's interesting, the word that's used there, he answers them, which, like, they didn't ask him a question, except they kind of did, didn't they? Bringing this guy into the meal. He responds to the situation and spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees. He spoke to the room, at least the part of the room that was sitting against him. Is it lawful, he said, to heal on the Sabbath? So it's like he's asking them, well, you guys are the guys who are supposed to know everything. You tell me. What do you think? And they're like, oh, nothing saying. They're pleading the fifth. This was intended to make you look bad, whatever you did, not make us look bad, whatever we did. Kind of like when a politician starts asking questions of the reporter. It's like, oh, no, you don't understand how this is supposed to work. I'm here to ask you questions. So they keep silent. And Jesus took the man with dropsy and healed him and let him go. Then he answered and said to them, which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And actually that was something there were certain things that were allowed by the rules of the day to do on the Sabbath, and this was actually one of them. If your ox or your donkey has something happen that if left to themselves they might die before Sabbath is over, you were given a dispensation in order to do that work on the Sabbath. But they couldn't draw the connection that meant that Jesus could heal people on the Sabbath. And then verse 6, it says they could not answer him regarding these things. And as we think about this being kind of the table fellowship moment, this is one of those awkward meals. You know, this is an election year, and you have strong Democrats and strong Republicans who all come over for Thanksgiving. You know, and it's kind of like the room is like, smells like gunpowder, and people are fingering their matchbooks. Not a very happy, you know, it's better to eat herbs in peace, right? than feasting with strife. This would be that type of situation. And yet, Jesus does what is the right thing to do, and for the guy who had dropsy, this was a pleasant, memorable meal, right? He could look back and say, that's the time, that's the place where I was healed. So you get 3 Pharisees. Also tax collectors. Matthew Levi invites Jesus home after Jesus calls him from the tax booth. He says, follow me. After that, it says in Matthew 5, verse 29, Levi gave a great feast in his own house. And there were a great number of tax collectors and others who sat down with them. And again, what a contrast this party versus the ruler of the Pharisees' party. The ruler of the Pharisees' party is like, I think Jesus is going to mess up, and I want to have as many people see it as possible. Matthew is, I've just realized this guy is like really important. This guy is the Messiah. I'm going to like change occupations based on this person asking me to follow him. And so he invites all of his friends, and my guess is for Matthew, his desire is for his friends to also follow Jesus. Quite a bit more welcoming table than the table of the Pharisees. And, by the way, what did the Pharisees say when Jesus eats with Matthew Levi and all his friends? They're like, what's the matter with you? Eating with tax collectors and sinners. Well, our second tax collector, Zacchaeus, and technically in this passage it doesn't say that Jesus ate with Zacchaeus. But I don't think culturally you can really consider this without realizing that he almost certainly did. When Zacchaeus invites him to his house, it is almost certainly a dinner invitation. So here's the story, Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. We got the first 5 up here now. Jesus entered and passed through Jericho, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. You all know the story. Chief tax collector, so he's the opposite party to the ruler of the Pharisees. He's on the other side of the social spectrum. And he wants to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, because he was of short stature. And again, what an interesting difference between the approach to Jesus of Zacchaeus and the approach to Jesus of the chief Pharisee. The chief Pharisee says, I'm going to invite you over, and he kind of sets things up. Zacchaeus is like, I can't even get to Jesus. the chief Pharisee says, "Clear the way, I'm coming through," and everybody parts. Zacchaeus is like, "Clear the way, I'm coming through," and everybody gets closer together. So he goes up the tree, famously, from the children's song at least, the sycamore tree, because he's going to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, "Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house." Verse 6, so Zacchaeus made haste and came down and received him joyfully. So here Zacchaeus has a desire to approach Jesus, but there's just too many barriers that are in the way, and Jesus bridges those barriers. Not only comes to Zacchaeus where he can see him, but talks to him and commands him to come down and tells him he's going to go to his house. So when they, that is the crowds, the religious leaders, saw it, they all complained, saying, "He has gone to be the guest with a man who is a sinner." Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost." So you get a great picture there of Jesus kind of welcoming himself into somebody's home. And so if you ever feel like bad about inviting yourself to someone's party, just know Jesus did it. So evidently under some circumstances it's okay. I'm not going to say every circumstance, but at least some of them it's obviously the right thing to do. As I thought through, and I'm trying to figure out all the different times where Jesus ate with people, there were two well-known examples that I thought about, and I'm guessing it was a little bit of a different situation, and that is the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000, or actually 5,000 first, 4,000 second. Matthew 14, Matthew 15, we see them in other Gospels. The crowds are there. They kind of run out of time. The places where people can buy food are too far away. And Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Feed them. It's time to eat. We're going to eat." And then in those stories, there's in the feeding of the 5,000, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Again, making it into the picture stories for little fingers, because there was a little boy who had this. That makes a great cartoon picture for Bibles for the young. Is usually the better known of the two. And what can we do with so little to feed so many? Jesus has them sit down, separate into groups, kind of like the first mass potluck. And when they're all done, there's 12 baskets of scraps. A chapter later, not sure how many months later, or days later, weeks later, they get in kind of a similar situation, only this time there's 4,000 people. Now they've got 7 loaves and a few little fish, and they don't say that they got it off a little boy. So maybe it was a little girl this time. She just went under the radar. Maybe the apostles had thrown stuff in their backpack or pockets, but got, peckish along the way, and this was all that was left. Or just as they try to figure out what was there, 7 loaves and a few little fish. It appears to be more food for less people, although we don't know how big the 2 fish were. But lunch for a little fella, how big a fish are you going to give him, A 30-pound salmon and a 300-pound tuna? Probably not. Probably small fish also. But with the larger amount for the fewer people, strangely, you get perhaps less left over. But in the first one, it says 12 baskets. Here it's 7 large baskets. And the normal, the words that get used here, the 12 baskets would be kind of the baskets that you can carry out in front of you. The large baskets would be like two-person baskets or one that you would carry up on your back. So as far as the, if you're like, how much food was this, think in terms of the difference between a sack of cat food and a sack of dog food, if that helps you with those with those amounts. And so it may have been the exact same amount was taken up. They just had different baskets available to them. But it is interesting that they're very different things. And then what I love about these stories is that if one had been found in one gospel and another had been found in another gospel, I can guarantee there would be people that would be trying to make this into one story. Where like, actually, if there are 5,000 people there are also 4,000 people there, right? And if you take up 12 baskets, you also took up 7 baskets. Except that we have the delightful little story later where Jesus says, you need to be careful of the 11 of the scribes and the Pharisees. And the disciples are like, oh no, it's because we have no bread again. Oh, we have no bread again. Why does this keep happening to us? No food. And Jesus is like, so, food is not a problem for me. You know, even Satan knows I can take a rock and turn it into a loaf if I have to. I'm worried about you going the way of the people that are against me rather than following me as true disciples. Didn't I, 5,000 people? How many baskets did you take up? They're like, 12. 4,000 people? How many baskets? 7. So he brings them both up as a, like, this is not, it's not like a one-off time. I've done this multiple times. You shouldn't be worried about not having bread. And so I think that's nice to, just as the gospel story. And maybe he did it more than twice. We don't know. Maybe there was the feeding of the 3,000 a couple months later. And Matthew's like, I'm going to just move on to some other story. Jesus eats with Mary and Martha in Luke chapter 10. Mary, Martha, Lazarus are famous in the raising of Lazarus, but we get this cool little story in Luke 10 about a different situation. And like a lot of, I think for whatever reason, a lot of ladies like this story about Mary and Martha, because Mary and Martha are two very different kinds of women. Mary is the one that's the, contemplative Bible study oriented person, and Martha is the, keep all the, serving spoons in the church kitchen organized type. And so so you have the story of these two ladies. Luke 10:38 says it happened as they went, he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me. Martha reminds us that tables do not set themselves. Okay? Turkeys do not cook themselves. Mashed potatoes do not mash themselves. Someone has got to do the grunt work if you're going to have a tasty meal on the table. And Martha is like, more hands make light work. And if you're not just going to, turn rocks into bread, Jesus, maybe you could turn Mary into a helper. And Jesus gently, and I love how Jesus phrases this, gently critiques Martha's heart. Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things. And again, here, she's worried and troubled about the externals, and sometimes the good externals. I like mashed potatoes that are mashed right? I like eggs that are neither undercooked nor overcooked. It's nice to have a table that someone has wiped before you eat off of it. To walk across the carpet in a restaurant without leaving a shoe behind. Not that that's a specific situation I encountered recently. Anyhow, that didn't actually happen. I had my shoelaces tied well, and I was thankful. She's worried about all those things, and those are worth worrying about. But there's something that's more important than that. And that is they had Jesus in the house. And so Jesus says, one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen the good part. You need to put on you want to put on a good spread and eat it with Jesus. The eating with Jesus is the important part, not the good spread. And this is the part that will not be taken away from her. Then, later on, and this is a story where it's actually Mary, the sister of Martha, that does this, we find from the book of John, the Gospel of John. In Matthew 26, Jesus is anointed again at the table. And while this happens, this time, instead of it being how could Jesus let her touch her? She's a sinful woman. Now the issue people are having is, how could Jesus let her squander this oil? It's so expensive. We could have sold it. We could have made a lot of money. A lot of poor people could have been fed for a long time with this. And Jesus, again, gently criticizes his disciples and says to them in verse 10, "Why do you trouble this woman? She has done a good work for me. You have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be a memorial to her." And at this point, I wanted to ask something I just thought was interesting. What did anybody eat at any of these meals? So far, we have exactly no idea, except for the 5,000, because it's the miracle. 4,000 is the miracle. But like this table, Simon the Pharisee's table, the other Pharisee's table, Levi the tax collector, Zacchaeus the tax, we've got no idea what was being served. Because that's not what's important. Even though a lot of times when people think about going to someone's house for dinner, the first question on their mind is, what are we eating? So that's all of these years you have heard this story and no one has told you what was eaten at that meal, because it doesn't matter. But that Mary poured this oil on Jesus for burial, Jesus said that's going to be remembered forever. And it has. Here we are, 2,000 years later, still talking about it. Perhaps the famous meal, certainly the most drawn meal, is the Last Supper. Matthew 26 or 28, the disciples are eating. Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it. We have a little bit of an idea about what was served at the Last Supper. It would have been Passover meal, so they almost certainly would have had lamb as part of it. We know he had bread. We know they drank wine. We know Jesus dipped the bread in his, what did he dip it in? The bowl. So what was in the bowl? Could have been oil. Probably not, tikka masala sauce or country gravy, but likely oil, perhaps something else. But they had that was a full meal that they would have eaten. I'm not sure if it goes back this far, but they commonly would eat bitter herbs with that meal. That was one of the things that they would eat to remind them of both the blessing of Jesus, of God bringing them out of slavery, but also the difficulty of the people not following the Lord, and then the wilderness wandering resulting from it. So, but that's only because we know something about Passover, not because the Bible describes it. But we do know this, and kind of reenact it. There was bread and there was wine, because that turns into what we have with communion, as John Miller said last Sunday, grape juice and gluten-free crackers. And so Not the whole deal. And I know churches that have done the whole thing, where they'll have a big meal. And at the end of a potluck type situation, they will do their communion time. I kind of like the idea, but it is a little more simple and perhaps easier to focus with the other way. But here, Jesus taking the things that are just right there on the table, because they would probably be there at every table the disciples ate at, and used the bread as a symbol of his body, used the wine as a symbol of his blood, and shared it with his disciples, and spoke about his upcoming death and the new covenant that he would be making, that would be cut in his body for the remission of sins for his people. And then, as we kind of roll out of, so the Last Supper wasn't, well, maybe it was the Last Supper, because the next time we see Jesus eating, it's actually breakfast. But anyhow, it was the Last Supper before the crucifixion. We're not sure how many suppers he had afterwards. The fish, great catch, second great catch of fish, one of the boat stories actually. Jesus meets them in Galilee. They're out there fishing. They're not catching anything. Jesus, for a second time, tells them to give it one more go, and they catch a load of fish, and they start bringing it to land. Peter puts on his outer garment and jumps in. Like I said, way back when, that's one of my favorite stories of Peter, because I'm guessing Peter thinks he's going to walk on water again, because nobody puts a coat on and then jumps in the water, right? I mean, what you're supposed to do is take it off. Kick your sandals off, take your coat off, jump in the water. But Peter's like, oh no, I'm going to take my coat with me. Gets his coat on, and he goes right in and swims to Jesus. Anyhow, they're bringing the boats, the nets to land, and they get there. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but I think it is kind of a unique picture of something that Jesus is trying to teach his disciples. One, when Peter says, what are we going to do after Jesus is raised? I know, let's go fishing. And Jesus is like, wait, I thought I told you that's not what you're doing these days. I thought I told you you're fishing people, not fish. And so they go and do this, and they don't have success. They're the experts, but it's not working for them. It takes Jesus' word for them to have success. Then they come to land, and there's Jesus, and interestingly, they see by Jesus a fire of coals, so it's a fire that's been burning for some time, and fish laid on it, and bread. So he's already got the barbecue up and the fish down and the buns toasting. But he says to them, bring some of the fish which you have just caught. If I was a more allegorical preacher, I think there's a lot that I could make out of that. You think about it. It's like Jesus doesn't need you. And certainly most of what you do, he doesn't need. But he will take a little bit to add to what he's already provided. I don't know if that's what Jesus was trying to communicate here. He is setting up poor Peter for, do you love me? Do you love me? And probably is he saying more than these, he's like this whole fishing thing, your occupation. It's time to decide, are you going to be a disciple or are you going to be a fisherman? And Peter gets the threefold command to feed the sheep, not catch the fish. But they came and they ate breakfast, some of Jesus's fish, and I guess anybody that wanted seconds got disciples' fish. But were they the disciples' fish? Anybody ever wonder how Jesus got his fish before the disciples got their fish? I've always kind of wondered about that. Did he go, here's a nice looking piece of driftwood, become fish. There's one. Here's another piece of wood, become fish. There's two. Or maybe he just whistled them up. He's like, and they, up comes the first fish. Flip, 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 flop onto the fire. Another fish. Flip, 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 flop onto the fire. Another fish. Flip, 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 flop onto the fire. I don't know. Maybe an eagle plucked it from the deep somewhere, flew overhead, and dropped it down onto the fire for him. But there they were, or maybe Jesus was just down there on a pier with a pole and a line and a piece of horsehair and a hook and a little bit of bait that he'd got at the local, Capernaum bait shop. I don't know. But he had enough fish, and they brought theirs too. And they, anyhow, he says, come and eat breakfast. And they ate breakfast together. And then, Luke 22, Jesus talks about eating in the kingdom. Jesus says to his disciples, I will bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And what are they going to be eating and drinking? Boy, just like a lot of things in heaven, we don't really know. And then, of course, the last, chronologically as well as scripturally, is the marriage supper of the Lamb. Revelation 19, 7 through 9. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him, that is the Lamb, Jesus, glory. For the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright. For the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Then he said to me, write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true sayings of God. And the feel that you get is this is the moment of like pulling out all the stops. And what's going to be served, we don't know. But I will tell you this, I'm sure it will be great, whatever it is. And some people might say, well, wait a second. In the resurrection, is there eating? So there's some things I don't know about heaven, but this I know. There will be eating. Because Jesus talks about when he's eating with his disciples, I'm not going to drink of the vine until I drink it again with you in the kingdom. He talks several times about the eating and drinking, and one of his favorite pictures of the kingdom is this marriage feast. And the reason the marriage feast is the picture he likes to use for the kingdom is because the marriage feast in that culture was where you pulled out all the stops. That was your time in those cultures to show just how much wealth you actually had. And if you ran out, for instance, of wine, that was very embarrassing because it meant that you hadn't calculated the amount of stuff of disposable income for the wedding you had versus the amount of friends that you thought were worth coming. And in many cultures that are like this, everybody kind of stays in, and what they want to know about the wedding was like how splendorous was the food. That's like really important, how much money gets spent on the wedding. And I'm actually glad, having 5 daughters myself, that after kind of really ramping up what a normal wedding ought to look like in the last 5 to 2 years, some of that has kind of come down a little bit. But just often a marriage is something that people just throw money at in order to show their importance within the community of people that get invited. Well, God has infinite ability to throw splendor into a wedding party. And so here the bride is arrayed in fine linen. The fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints, which shows there is kind of a metaphorical aspect of this. But anyhow, it's an interesting picture, and it's kind of the last hurrah, so to speak, as John pulls out of his here's how things are going to go down as time goes by. Now, I have some points to ponder here at the end, just a few, and I'm not going to belabor them. The number one, first, not necessarily most important. Usually I save most important for the last, but something to consider. The table is a place to create and develop friendships. There's a reason why Christians are called to be hospitable, and why hospitality often involves sitting around a table. That it is a good place to make deeper relationships, and Christ uses, like the upper room, that's some of the most personal teaching that Jesus gives to his disciples around a table as they are on the cusp of his crucifixion. Second, I think it's interesting, and you've seen this as we've looked through this, through Scripture during this lesson. All kinds of people eat with Jesus. The people that you would look at and say are really good, and Jesus says, well, they're kind of not. And people that you might look at and say, oh, they're really bad, and Jesus says, no, not so quick. And boy, the one that we are, the story that we began with, our passage that we're using as the kind of foundation for this study, is two ends of that spectrum. Very, very different kinds of people. A famously righteous person in town and a famously sinful person in town, and they both end up at the same table with Jesus. I think that should, I guess, in some ways, warn us, perhaps encourage us, perhaps a little of both. When you look around, like churches and places where people are gathering in the name of Jesus, there might be all kinds of people there. People that come because they want to be seen, people that come because this is what good people do, people that come because they're just tired of sinning and they're hoping that the community of faith is somewhere where they can get the help that they need in the person of Jesus Christ. People that have just fallen head over heels in love with Jesus, and that's where they experience Jesus the most deeply, and so that's where they're going to be. All sorts of people end up in this table fellowship situation in the New Testament. Third, at the table with Jesus, there is much more going on than eating. In fact, the act of eating is almost never even mentioned. Right? It never says, and Jesus picked an olive out of the bowl and popped it in his mouth. Chewed twice and swallowed. Much of it, like I said before, we don't even know what food was involved. And so it's the other things. It's the relational things that matter. And as you look at the relational things that are going on, there's two kinds of relationships that are going on around the table with Jesus. One is the relationship of the person with Jesus, right? And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. But also, there's a relationship of one person with another person that's not Jesus. So you've got the relationship of the sinful woman with the proud Pharisee. You've got the relationship of the man who has dropsy with the ruler of the Pharisees. It's not always explicit, but sometimes it is. You have the relationship. I think perhaps the best one to see the relationship is the relationship between Mary and Martha, two sisters with differing approaches on how to make Jesus happy. But it's the relational things that matter. Fourth, you can dine with Jesus for all the wrong reasons, and some people did. And you see that from early ministry to even as far as Judas eating with Jesus at the Passover meal. And then fifth, last, and like I say, what I consider the most important, if you love him, Jesus is happy to join your table or to have you join his. And that's something that I think is kind of interesting, is that a lot of times Jesus is going to people at their table. A lot of times. But other times, Jesus is like, no, I'll set the table. You come to me. Doesn't matter whether it's your table or Jesus' table. I'm just going to say, as long as Jesus is there, I'm not too concerned about the table. And so hopefully, by kind of looking at this, we see a lot of different. So last time we were like two major approaches to Jesus. Today was a little bit more of the nuance. There's two major approaches, but there's also a lot of little differences in how they go. We obviously want to be like this lady that comes and worships Jesus with her tears and her oil to anoint him. Not be like the Pharisee, like if Jesus does one thing we think is sketchy, we're out of here or he's out of here. But there are many, many different people with different approaches, and Jesus just works his way through all of these different people and relationships. All right, so let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. I thank you for the opportunity we have to fellowship with Jesus. Lord, we look forward to the day when we are able to sit at a table with him, physically in his presence in resurrected bodies, and enjoy that camaraderie that comes over a table. Lord, we also would pray that you would help us in our own lives to be willing to spend time with people, willing to draw close to people, willing to enjoy Christ together, specifically as believers, Lord, and that you would bless us as we do that we would draw closer to one another and we would draw closer to Christ. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thank you.